Welcome to Anews. I'm Amir Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. In today's episode, Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar will be joining me to discuss the top stories from this week. We'll be taking a look at the war in Gaza, ongoing trade wars, and the Terror-Free Turkey initiative. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Israeli troops will remain in the buffer zones they have created in Gaza even after any settlement to end the war, Defense Minister Israel Katz has said, as efforts to revive a January ceasefire agreement faltered. This was Katz in Gaza in December, when he also spoke of creating buffer zones. Israel resumed military operations on March 18, after 2 months of relative calm. This video is said to show them in Gaza, though Reuters was unable to confirm exactly where and when. Since March, its forces have carved out what Israel calls a security zone extending deep into Gaza, squeezing more than 2 million Palestinians into ever smaller areas and displacing more than 400,000, according to UN humanitarian agency OCHA. While Israeli airstrikes and bombardments have killed at least 1,630 Palestinians in that time, with medical charity MSF saying Gaza has become a mass grave. Palestinian medical authorities said Israeli military strikes across the Gaza Strip killed at least 35 Palestinians on Wednesday alone. This one was on an encampment of displaced people in Khan Yunis. Katz said an Israeli blockade on the delivery of aid into the territory, imposed in early March, would remain. Unlike in the past, Katz said in a statement on Wednesday after meeting military commanders, the IDF is not evacuating areas that have been cleared and seized. The Israeli military said it now controls 30% of the tiny Palestinian territory. Israel says its forces have killed hundreds of Hamas fighters, including many senior commanders, since March 18. Israel's offensive has killed at least 51,000 Palestinians, according to local health authorities. Katz said Israel would pursue a plan to allow Gazans who wish to leave the enclave to do so, but it remains unclear which countries would be willing to accept large numbers of Palestinians. And many Palestinians say they won't leave, fearing permanent displacement.
Welcome to the program. Mustafa Kocakanar, our Anews editor. Welcome to the program as well.
Thanks for hosting me.
Mustafa, now let's start our discussion today with what's happening in the occupied Gaza Strip. Hamas has proposed a new ceasefire deal where it's asking for the release of Palestinian prisoners. And Israel has also offered another counter-proposal where it's saying that it would be a 45-day truce. 10 hostages will be released and over 1,200 Palestinian prisoners will be released from the Israeli jails. How are you looking at this proposal? Do you believe we can get a comprehensive ceasefire?
Umar, Israeli decision makers are still insisting on Israel's deadly military campaign in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip. Since October 2023, more than 50,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been murdered by the Israeli security forces. And Israel is still continuing to block the entry of humanitarian aid to the war-torn Gaza Strip. On the other hand, as we know, there are some negotiations between Israeli side and Palestinian resistance group Hamas. But the recent truce talks held in Egypt's capital, Cairo, ended without breakthrough between two warring sides. And Israel's defense minister, Israeli Katz, recently made important statement about post-war Gaza Strip, and he claimed that Israeli security forces, even after the war, will continue to stay in the Gaza Strip's buffer zone. he claimed that Israel will create new buffer zones in the Gaza Strip, just like they created in Lebanon. And it is raising concerns among regional stakeholders in terms of ensuring a long-lasting peace and stability in the Middle East, because regional countries, particularly Turkey, is accusing Israel and Israeli decision makers of increasing and escalating geopolitical tensions in the region. I think with the cooperation among regional countries, all stakeholders in the Middle East will increase pressure on Israel to convince the Israeli decision makers to stop their military campaign in the Gaza Strip, because otherwise geopolitical tensions will create a new chaos and humanitarian tragedy in the Middle East.
Mustafa, I want your opinion on something that I've been thinking for a very long time, and it's not just me. People all across the world are also thinking the same thing. What would be the perfect ceasefire where Hamas and Israel both get their fair share of their demands? Now, Israel says that Hamas must disarm and leave the occupied Gaza Strip, but that is not likely going to happen because Hamas is a resistance movement and it's protecting the rights of the Palestinians. So how would you describe a perfect ceasefire where the hostages would return and the Palestinian prisoners would return and Palestinians would get to stay in the occupied Gaza Strip rather than being displaced to other countries? How would you describe such a ceasefire? What do we need at this point?
Omar, we can clearly say that right now Palestinian resistance group Hamas is in favor of dialogue and diplomacy to resolve disputes with Israel. But on the other hand, Israeli decision makers are in favor of ongoing warfare in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is seeking new ceasefire deal with Israel to put an end to the ongoing suffering in the war-torn and war-weary Gaza Strip. But on the other hand, Israelis are claiming new things from Hamas. As you say, they are urging Hamas to leave Gaza immediately and to lay down their weapons. But in reality, Hamas is an indispensable part of the Palestinian territory and in the Gaza Strip. As we know, Hamas won the general elections in the Palestinian territories in 2007. And since then, they have been running the Gaza Strip. I think it is impossible for Hamas to lay down their weapons and to leave Gaza for good. Within this context, I think Israel is looking the ceasefire negotiations with Hamas to get what it wants from the Palestinian people. I don't think that with this attitude by Israel, any long-standing ceasefire will be reached by the stakeholders. I think right now United States is the only country in the world to convince Israel to reach and strike a ceasefire deal with Hamas. But we know that U.S. President Donald Trump is one of the most important supporters of Israel's genocidal acts and ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. As you know, there was a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas until mid-March. But then Israeli decision makers started to think that the renewed military campaign in Gaza is one of the best options to keep Israeli Prime Minister, embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, politically alive in the country. Because as we know, Israeli people called the Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a crime minister, because there are some trials in Israel. They are still ongoing against Netanyahu over his corruption allegations. And right now, Trump should have pushed Netanyahu to stop his war cabinet's military offensive in the region. But on the contrary, to these issues, Trump is still insisting United States ironclad support for Israel's military campaign in the region. And I don't think that with this attitude taken by Trump and Netanyahu, there can't be long-standing peace and stability in the Middle East if the international community, particularly Western countries, want to see long-standing peace and tranquility in the region. I think they should give their strong support for the recognition of the Palestinian state and Palestinian independence immediately.
Mustafa, like you said, I completely agree with you that there's so much pressure on Netanyahu as well, because the Israeli public is saying that the Israeli government wants to gain more territory rather than release the hostages. So obviously, there's unrest at home as well. The people want a new government, but Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing so many corruption charges. There are multiple cases that he's facing. So it's going to be extremely difficult for him to gain the support at home. But internationally, like you said, Donald Trump is a big supporter of Netanyahu. And it's not just the United States, it's the European Union as well, right?
Omar, as you know, thousands of Israeli people have been regularly taking to streets to express their frustration over Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's domestic and foreign policies. They are calling for the resignation of the Israeli Prime Minister because they are accusing Netanyahu of endangering the lives of hostages held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And they are calling upon Netanyahu to prioritize diplomacy and dialogue with Hamas to release hostages held in the Gaza Strip. But Netanyahu is still continuing to turn a blind eye to demands coming from both its Israeli public opinion and the international community. Yes, some European countries are reiterating their strong support for Israel's so-called national security in the Middle East. But on the other hand, they are also criticizing Israeli decision makers for deteriorating the humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip. They are also calling for diplomacy and dialogue to stop the Israeli offensive in the region. As you know, this month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu paid an official visit to Hungary, and he met with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Budapest. At the same time, Hungary decided to withdraw from the International Criminal Court because ICC issued arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over his war cabinet's genocidal acts in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip. And Hungary refused to arrest Netanyahu because they were supposed to detain Netanyahu. I think right now ICC is investigating Hungary's decision about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Turkey is leading the international community to increase awareness about Israel's ethnic cleansing in the Middle East and in the occupied Palestinian territories. I think the international community should take Turkey's warnings about Israel into consideration, and they will increase pressure on Israel and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to put an end to the ongoing conflicts and to reach long-standing peace and stability in the Middle East region.
Now let's take a look at this news report about American tariffs, and once we return back to the studio, we'll be talking about the United States and China.
U.S. President Donald Trump touted big progress in tariff talks with Japan on Wednesday, after one of the first face-to-face negotiations since he imposed sweeping global duties earlier this month, most of which he later paused for 90 days. Japan had not expected the president to get involved in Wednesday's talks, which it had been hoping to limit to trade and investment matters. But when Trump announced his involvement early in the day, he said the discussion agenda included the amount Japan pays towards hosting U.S. troops. Afterwards, Trump said on social media that meeting the Japanese delegation had been a, quote, great honor, and that big progress had been made without giving details. Opposite Trump in the meeting was Ryosei Akazawa, a close confidant of Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. He spoke to reporters after the talks.
Meetings with Japan are a priority. When Trump says that there are 70 or 100 countries in line, there's no way the president can attend all of them. So the talks with Japan are a priority. I think his presence is a clear sign of that.
Ishiba sounded a more cautious tone speaking to reporters later in Tokyo, saying that negotiations going forward, quote, will not be easy. Trump earlier this month blasted Japan for what he said was a 700% tariff on rice, a figure Tokyo disputes. Levies on autos are particularly painful for Japan, as cars make up nearly a third of the country's shipments to the U.S., its biggest export market. Trump's involvement is a potential sign he wants to keep tight control over negotiations with dozens of countries expected over coming days and weeks. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni heads to the White House on Thursday to discuss tariffs imposed on the European Union with Trump. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has invited South Korea's finance minister to Washington for talks next week.
Welcome back to the program. Now, Mustafa, let's talk about trade tariffs. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was in the United States discussing a trade deal with the U.S. and also the sanctions and the tariffs that President Trump has paused for now, but he will, after 90 days, restart them. Now, Mustafa, tell me, do you believe that there is any comprehensive deal which can be reached? And, since both of these sides are having so many multiple problems, do you think that this is only going to deepen the rifts between the two sides?
Omar, as you said, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni paid an official visit to the United States yesterday, and U.S. President Donald Trump welcomed the Italian Premier to the White House to discuss bilateral relationships between Italy and the United States, as well as exchanging views on the trade disputes between the United States and the European Union. I think right now Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is trying to be a mediator between the American sides and European sides to strike a trade deal between two major economic powerhouses. As you know, 2 weeks ago, U.S. President Donald Trump announced his administration's reciprocal tariffs against dozens of countries in the world. And Trump's sweeping tariffs literally triggered a trade war among major economic powerhouses in the world. But as we know, after a backlash coming from the American investors and the international community, Trump decided to pause most tariffs for 90 days. I think Trump is also seeking to pave the way for new negotiations among international stakeholders to reach a new trade deal. Within this context, Trump is hosting Italian Prime Minister, and his Vice President J.D. Vance is right now going to Italy's capital, Rome, to discuss what can be done in terms of reaching a new trade deal. But Trump's trade policies, I think, are increasing concerns among European nations because they are also taking their own steps to retaliate against tariffs imposed by the U.S. president. And within this context, I think next month or next weeks, we will see diplomacy and dialogue between American and European decision makers. But if they continue to take this attitude towards their trade policies, I don't think that any comprehensive trade deal between the European Union and the United States will be reached.
Mustafa, in such a situation, if you are being imposed, if tariffs are being imposed on you, you would definitely look towards other countries. You would look towards cheaper options. And you would try to ensure that your government is making deals with another country so that it's for the benefit of everyone, of both sides involved. Now, one such country is China. Now, obviously, a lot of countries in the European Union and in Asia are moving towards China because China is selling products and services at a cheaper rate than what you can get from the United States. So tell me about China's response, because this week, Chinese President Xi Jinping was on a tour of Southeast Asia. He visited Malaysia, he visited Vietnam and Cambodia. And let me tell you about some of the things that were discussed. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has said that the West has retreated into economic tribalism. And China has offered these countries cooperation in technology and artificial intelligence as well. Now, since we're talking about artificial intelligence and technology, this is definitely the future. How are these countries looking to make a deal with China which benefits both sides?
Omar, as we know, there is ongoing geopolitical and geoeconomic rivalry between the United States and China. And after Trump's tariff threats against China, Chinese President Xi Jinping reiterated his country's determination to protect its national security against United States threats. And within this context, as you say, Xi Jinping visited Malaysia, Vietnam and Cambodia this week to strengthen bilateral or multilateral cooperation among these countries to encounter United States hegemonic economy agenda. As you know, Trump is always accusing China of taking advantage of the American companies for years. And right now, Trump is claiming that we will protect the American countries from China's influence. And these trade policies are reshaping the geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region. As you know, Trump's economic policies are raising concerns among the United States' traditional allies in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan and South Korea are two of the important American allies in the Asia-Pacific region. United States and many American decision makers and American international relations scholars think that South Korea and Japan will be used to encounter rising China in the region. But Trump's policies are pushing these two important countries into the hands of China. As we know, Japan and South Korea signed new economic agreements with China to strengthen their positions in the region against tariff threats coming from the United States. As we know, Trump is also imposing tariffs against Japan and South Korea. And as our news story claimed that right now there are ongoing trade negotiations among American decision makers and Asian countries. And I think that if Trump and the United States will insist on their tariffs policies and trade wars against dozens of countries in the world, I don't think that United States will balance China's rising geopolitical influence in the Asia-Pacific region with its own stance. I think United States will need help coming from its traditional allies in the Asia-Pacific region, I think Trump's trade advisors will find a way to convince U.S. President Donald Trump to reverse his decision about the trade wars among major economic powerhouses in the world.
Mustafa, yeah, it makes sense because now, even though these countries like Japan, South Korea, China, they've had bad relations, but, now they're moving towards a free trade agreement. So this goes on to show that, people are, and governments are, and the public is willing to move away from, the traditional partnerships. Just to remind our audiences what happened during that trip, China and Vietnam have signed defense agreements, development projects. There's a joint railway that they're going to build. There's maritime security. And, the entire focus of this visit of Xi Jinping to these countries was to tell these leaders to move away from their traditional allies. Now, we are going to talk about Türkiye and some of the most important topics and the agenda that Türkiye is facing after this news report.
Türkiye has reaffirmed its commitment to fostering peace and stability in the Middle East, highlighting its support for Syria's territorial integrity and the establishment of legitimate governance across the war-torn country.
Establishing stability in Syria, preserving territorial integrity and the establishment of legitimate authority by the new government throughout the country are of critical importance for the future of our region. In this context, as the Turkish armed forces, we continue to support the construction of Syria's security and defense capacity.
Türkiye also reiterated its firm stance against terrorism, declaring that any group refusing to lay down arms or inciting division will remain a legitimate target, just as they have been in the past.
Completely ending all forms of terrorism will contribute to the peace of not only our country but also our region and the world. Every structure that insists on not laying down arms and tries to incite separation rather than brotherhood will continue to be our legitimate goal today as it was yesterday.
Türkiye's diplomatic posture in the Middle East continues to focus on stability, humanitarian access, and the prevention of further conflict, while cautioning all actors to respect its constructive efforts.
We are in favor of solving problems in the region through dialogue. Our aim is to prevent any unwanted incidents from occurring in the region. However, I would like to emphasize that we will not allow these developments to prevent the indispensable needs and demands of the region from being met. This positive approach of our country should not be exploited by any actor. This approach of ours is to contribute to the search for stability in the region.
Hiçbir aktör tarafından istismar edilmemelidir.
Welcome back to the program. Now, Mustafa, the problem that Turkey has faced for the last 40 plus years has been the issue of the PKK. Erdogan has stressed that now Turkey needs a terror-free Turkey, and this was also an initiative taken by MHP leader Devlet Bahçeli. How important is this terror-free Turkey, and how can it improve regional security?
Omar, as we know, Turkish security forces are continuing its counter-terrorism operations against PKK within and beyond Turkey's borders. I can clearly say that right now PKK has been totally eradicated from the Turkish territory. But on the other hand, some PKK members are still operating in northern Syria and northern Iraq. And Turkey initiated terror-free Turkey initiative to increase Turkey's national security and national defense capabilities. Within this context, last year, Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli called on the PKK terror group to dissolve itself. And this year, at the end of February, PKK's imprisoned ringleader Abdullah Öcalan urged the PKK members to lay down their weapons and to dissolve itself. And right now, PKK is preparing to hold its so-called Congress this spring. And Turkish decision makers are urging the PKK terrorists to announce its dissolution in this Congress and to lay down their weapons. As you know, after Öcalan's statement, PKK announced its unilateral so-called ceasefire against the Turkish state. But Turkish decision makers are claiming that in the Öcalan's statement, there is no such thing as a ceasefire. PKK is completely supposed to lay down its weapons and dissolute itself. Right now, Turkish decision makers and pro-PKK party officials within the Turkish parliament are continuing to give strength to talks between them to reach long-standing peace and tranquility in Turkey. On the other hand, as we know, geopolitical situation changed in Syria in December, and a new government led by Ahmet al-Shara reached a deal with PKK terrorist groups Syrian offshoot, PYD, YPG, and right now Syrian national security forces are taking control of the northern Syria. As you know, Turkey launched several cross-border operations against PKK terror groups, Syrian branch, PYD, YPG, to ensure its security on its southern borders. And right now, Turkish decision makers are closely following the developments and agreement reached by PYD, YPG-dominated SDF and new rulers in Syria. But I think that if there is separate PYD, YPG structure in northern Syria, I think Turkish security forces will be compelled to pursue another cross-border operations in the region to totally eliminate and eradicate the threat coming from the PKK terrorist groups, Syrian offshoot PYD, YPG.
Mustafa, moving from terrorism to another problem that Turkey is facing, it's with its neighbor Greece. Now, this week, the Greek officials presented their maritime spatial planning report to the European Union. But what that does is it violates Turkey's maritime jurisdiction. Now, how is Turkey responding to the events that have happened this week? And what is its response? Because Greece is trying to control areas or jurisdictions which are under Turkey's control. So how is Turkey reacting to those developments?
Umar, Turkey and Greece have been sharing same geography and same history, but on the other hand, there are many challenges poisoning the bilateral relationships between Ankara and Athens. As you know, Greece recently announced its so-called maritime spatial planning. And it is totally violating Turkey's maritime rights in the Aegean Sea. Within this context, Turkish Foreign Ministry issued a written statement condemning Greece's recent maritime spatial planning announcement. And Turkish Foreign Ministry called Greece's maritime spatial planning totally null and void. And as you know, Turkey is trying to improve its relationships with Greece in recent years. But statements and actions taken by the Greek decision makers are increasing the tensions between two important NATO allies. As we know, Turkey is always calling for good neighborly relationships with Greece, but I think that it doesn't mean that Turkey will allow any fait accompli in the Aegean Sea or Eastern Mediterranean. As we also know, Turkey and Greece are also competing in the Eastern Mediterranean. There is Cyprus issue between Turkey and Greece. While Turkey is calling for a two-state solution on the island, Greece is still insisting on the federal state on the island. but it is totally rejecting the geopolitical realities on the ground, because right now there are two separate nations living on the Cyprus island. One nation is Turkish Cypriots and the other nation is Greek Cypriots. Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar is always saying that the two-state solution will be the realistic on the ground, because he is always calling for sovereign equality between Turkish and Greek Cypriots. I think Greeks decision makers will pull themselves together in terms of increasing cooperation and collaborations with Turkey to address the common security threats. I think Turkey will continue to prioritize dialogue and diplomacy to deal with its bilateral disputes with Greece, but it doesn't mean that Turkey will sit on idle and will allow any fait accompli in the Aegean Sea and Eastern Mediterranean.
And you're right, Mustafa, because you cannot have neighborly relations if the Greek general, the Greek army chief, is saying that we can respond to Turkey within 5 minutes. And Turkish officials have dismissed that comment. They've laughed on it. They've said this is not likely to happen. And even if it does, Turkish forces are not going to sit down and relax, and they're going to respond to whatever Greece has to say. Anyway, Mustafa, now I want to talk to you about the Indonesian president's visit to the country last week. Indonesia, it says it's willing to join Turkey's Khan fighter jet project, and Turkish defense companies are also looking to open their factories in Indonesia. Now, tell me, Mustafa, what does this tell us about Turkey's defense industry and Turkey targeting Asian countries? Obviously, we know they've been selling drones and other equipments to European countries and countries in Africa. But now this is a new beginning, let's say. How is Turkey responding to these moves? How is Turkey going to engage with these countries in Asia when it comes to defense?
Omar, in February, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan visited three nations in Asia, and Indonesia was one of these countries. And last week, in return, Indonesian President paid an official visit to Turkey, and Erdogan welcomed Subianto to the presidential complex in the capital of Ankara. And Turkish and Indonesian foreign policy makers discussed all aspects of bilateral political, economic and military relationships between Turkey and Indonesia, and exchange views on the regional and global security challenges. And in a joint press conference, both the Turkish and Indonesian presidents reiterated their countries' determination to strengthen and enhance bilateral relationships between Turkey and Indonesia. Within this context, Indonesia is seeking to be part of Turkey's Khan fighter jet program. As you know, Turkey is working on its homegrown fifth generation Khan fighter jet program. I think it will enter the Turkish military fleet within maximum 5 years, and Indonesia wants to be part of that program. Turkey is also reiterating its strong support for Indonesia's national defense capabilities and national defense initiatives. I think increasing collaboration and cooperation within the defense industry between Turkey and Indonesia will give strength to the Muslim world. As you know, both nations are leading Muslim nations in the international community in terms of increasing awareness about Israel's genocidal acts and ethnic cleansing in the occupied Palestinian territories. I think collaboration and cooperation between Turkey and Indonesia will yield positive results in terms of dealing with the security challenges facing the Muslim communities in the world. And I hope that Turkey and Indonesia will be able to strengthen their cooperation within the defense industry to address common security challenges and to ensure long-standing international peace, stability and tranquility.
Mustafa Kojakanar, we believe we're at the end of our program for now. So thank you for your analysis. It's always a pleasure having you in the studio and discussing multiple topics and listening to your analysis.
You are welcome, Omar.
That brings us to the end of today's episode of Turkey's Diplomacy. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the key developments from around the world. Catch us in the next episode. Bye for now.